Hey everybody, it's Lucas. And number 22, we got Come Out Tonight by Richard Lehman. This was written in the late 90s, a trashy slasher horror book. These are kind of my guilty pleasures. I've read several Richard Lehman books. None of them have been particularly good, but I just find them really easy to read. And even though his books are too long and just have really gross things that I'd prefer not to read in them, I just keep coming back to them for some reason. This book in particular follows a woman whose boyfriend goes missing in Los Angeles. She goes looking after him and hijinks ensue. Pretty bad book. Do not recommend it. I will read more Richard Lehman books because I've got problems and I just, for some reason, really enjoy the slasher genre. But for some reason, you can't read them without the authors inputting some of the most just questionable decisions that they've ever put on a page. At number 21, I've got The Blessing Way by Tony Hillerman, book number 1 in the Lee Porn and Chi series. This is a detective novel dating back to the early 70s that's still being written today, I believe, by Tony Hillerman's daughter after he passed away. Adapted into a TV show by AMC called Dark Winds that came out a couple of years ago, produced by George R. R. Martin. This is it's a fine detective kind of pulpy book that takes place on the Navajo reservation. Lieutenant Joe Leaphorn has to investigate who did this murder. And there's like some things with like the drug trade and just Native American occultism going on. Looking back at it, it feels a bit amateurish, just the lack of coherence that's going on in the plot lines. I expect that it gets better, and I've heard it does get better as the series goes on. They're short books. I'm willing to kind of try them out later on, but The Blessing Way, it was fine. At number 20, I have Rokanan's World by Ursula K. Le Guin, book 1 in the Hainish cycle. This is fine. First video I ever did on this channel was actually a review of it. It's a book from the 60s. It's kind of like a weird fantasy sci-fi mixture that's, I would say, the main thing of interest that's got going for it. It's not bad. It's really short and it kind of lacks substance to me. And I would say a couple weeks after I read it, I kind of forgot most of the things that's happened in it. At number 19, I have Grave Peril by Jim Butcher, book number 3 in the Dresden Files. This one I was hoping it would be a step up from Full Moon and Stormfront, but for me, it was kind of just more of the same. I thought a lot of the world building in this book especially was kind of taking on a path to being a series that I enjoyed a little bit more, but the actual mystery itself was a little bit disappointing. And I'm still at that point where I really would like to get in this series, but I just haven't really been convinced yet at this point. At number 1, I have The Black Echo, book number 1 in the Bosch books by Michael Connolly. I read this one towards the beginning of the year. I'd be lying if I said I remembered a lot that happens in it. I'm a big fan of the Bosch TV show, or at least the first few seasons that I've seen of it. The story of the first book was adapted into one of the seasons that I've seen, so I kind of knew generally what was going to happen with the plot. I would say it's a pretty standard, like early 90s police procedural with a strong central character that he obviously kind of hit a home run on, being that he's written like 30 books in the series and is one of the most famous crime authors or mystery authors of all time. It was good. It's a good, competently written book. Again, like a lot of these books that are part of series early in the list, I wish I got a little bit more out of it. Book number 17 is Dungeon Crawler Carl by Matt Dinneman, book number 1 in that universe. This is a good book. I wish I liked it a little bit more. The audiobook's obviously excellent, just like anybody else will tell you. The central premise, kind of like a post-apocalyptic game show, I thought was really well done and really interesting. I think the issues that I have with this book specifically are more personal. I think the jokes, the manner of kind of comedy that's done in this book, there's some really good jokes. And I would be lying if I didn't say I didn't laugh several times, but there are so many jokes that didn't land for me, that it got a little bit grating at times. I also just don't think I'm really that big of a fan of lit RPG in general. The whole method of characters leveling up and stuff, I don't know if it's weird because I play a lot of video games. I think I'd like it a lot more, but it's just for some reason, it just kind of bothers me a little bit. I like kind of more natural progression in my stories generally, but again, just like a lot of the other books, this is definitely one that I will try book 2. I don't know if I'm going to try it anytime soon, but I want to like the books, and obviously they're great to listen to. So hopefully I can get back into them at some point. Number 16, I have Planet Exile by Ursula K. Le Guin. This was the last book that I read. I think I finished it on December 31st. Sequel-ish kind of, book number 2 in the Hainish cycle compared to Rokanan's World. I think this book a little bit more focused. I enjoyed the plot a lot more, but again, it suffers with a lot of the things that I had with the first book, which is they feel a little bit underbaked. I feel like the premise wasn't really expanded on to the point that I would prefer in a book. It's nice that you can just kind of pick it up and read it. I read the book in like 2 days, and it takes like a couple hours to finish it. Again, interesting premise. Wish there was a little bit more to it, and some interesting themes to take away from it. But again, nothing I will probably remember in a few months. Number 15, we have Read by Jack Ketchum. Jack Ketchum, horror author. This isn't really a horror book, but it's about a man whose dog is essentially murdered by a few teenagers, and he's just trying to get justice served against him. Out of the 4 Jack Ketchum books that I've read so far, this is definitely my least favorite, in that the other 3 are all books that I enjoyed pretty greatly. And I thought this one was just like a solid kind of drama / a little bit of like thriller thrown in kind of book. But I'll enjoy pretty much any Jack Ketchum book, at least to a minimum, because I just really enjoy the kind of stories that he brings to the table. And we'll talk about him a little bit later. Top 12 80s, number 14 by Jim Thompson. This is a mid 1960s crime fiction kind of pulp novel about a sheriff in a small town who might be a little bit more than you think at first in terms of quality of character. I heard a lot of people kind of describe this as like Child of God, but better. I'm a huge fan of Child of God. I just really enjoy the book a lot. I like books about terrible people doing terrible things. So picked this up, gave it a shot. Solid book. I don't like it as much as I like Child of God, but it kept me compelled all the way through. After I finished it, I have some flaws with the book that I would bring up and kind of like more of a spoiler discussion. Of course, I don't think this book was perfect by any means, but I enjoyed it, and I will definitely read The Killer Inside Me, which is, I believe, his most popular book. Number 13, we have Shards of Honor by Lois McMaster Bujold, number 1 book in the Vork Hoskin saga. Again, book number 1 because I can't stop starting series. This is a science fiction kind of shorter novels, a little bit of like, space drama / warring factions, a little bit of romance thrown in there, or more than a little bit, I guess, in this book. This is a good book. Again, not a lot to add. A lot of the books kind of lower on my list were just ended up being a bit shorter for whatever reason. I enjoyed this book. I will read Briar this year at some point, but solid book. That's really all I have to say about it. Number 12, I have Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie. This is my, second review that I did on the channel, and my least favorite book in the series so far, but still a quality book. Doesn't have the same level of character work that I thought the original trilogy had, and I think it's a little bit long. But other than that, you've got all the staples, and it's Joe Abercrombie. This is like the minimum, I think, for what I think I'll get out of him, out of the rest of his books. And I still think it's a good book and enjoyed it quite a bit. Number 11, I have Assassin's Apprentice, book number 1 in the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb. I read this book several months ago, and when I come back and think about it, I just think it's just a solid book. Really nothing in it that blew me away. I'm kind of going through Royal Assassin pretty slowly over the last several months. I'm about halfway through at this point and enjoying it a bit more, but back to Assassin's Apprentice. It's got a pretty standard traditional fantasy plot. The character work's obviously what people come into the series expecting to get the most out of, and I thought it was pretty good, but I think a lot of character work will be a bit later on is when I'll truly come to like appreciate what's going on in some points. But I don't really like how the antagonists are portrayed in this book. I think it's a bit simple at this point, but other than that, it's just a solid, well done book. Okay, so the top 10. Number 10 is going to be Speaks the Nightbird by Robert McCammon, book number 1 in the Matthew Corbett series. This book is pretty long. I came into it, I think I've read just Swan Song, and Swan Song was kind of a disappointment for me. I came into this book expecting it to be a little bit more serious. The cover kind of makes it seem like it's going to be literary fiction, but this is not really literary fiction at all. It's kind of like a weird mixture of like historical fiction and like a mystery that's going on, but there's a lot of kind of like goofy elements that are thrown into this book that I thought were well done. I think for some people it's some of their least favorite parts of the book, but story about kind of like a witch hunt going on in early colonial America. Just a fun story to go through. I think it loses the plot a little bit at the end, but I thought the characters were fun to follow. I think it's just like one of those books that has like a very unique plot line. It's not really a time and period that I've read a lot about, but I think it for a book that's as long as it is, Robert McCammon does an excellent job of keeping us engaged in what's going on. And Queen of Bedlam, I've also heard good things about. I'll probably get to it as well. Maybe this year. I don't know. I'm pretty happy reading it as a standalone myself, but I've heard good things about the rest of the series, and I'm definitely going to try them out at some point. At number 9, I have Master and Commander by Patrick O'Brian. This is the first book in the Aubrey Maturin series, following a captain and a surgeon on a Royal Navy ship for the British Navy during the Napoleonic Wars. This book, unlike Speaks the Nightbird, kind of throws away that like accessible approach that Robert McCammon puts in, and Patrick O'Brian is completely like involved in just immersing the reader in the Napoleonic times. It's written in a very kind of like early Victorian style, to kind of how I would imagine people actually like wrote and spoke back in those days. And it obviously has a lot to do with like the ships and the Navy and fighting against the French and the Spanish and all the stuff that was going on back then. But it's really, if you're interested in just like how people lived back then, how like the research of nature and geography was, there's a lot of interesting things. You can tell that Patrick O'Brian was extremely interested in, back in a time when the computer wasn't around, you know, the 50s, 60s, I think when this book was written, you can tell that this was like a passion in life for him, was learning about, you know, how people lived their lives back in the day. And just as an artifact of how life was back then, it's just an interesting read. At number 8, I have The Girl Next Door by Jack Ketchum. This is kind of a horror classic based on the Sylvia Likens true crime story. It's about a girl that's pretty much not kidnapped, but held, tortured by her adoptive family. This is a really dark book. There's not a lot of levity to it, as there shouldn't be a lot of levity in a book like this. I think a lot of people take issue with, you know, adapting a true crime of something that's a horrible story. One of the worst stories you could probably learn about that's actually happened. But as a work of horror, I think, you know, part of the point of the genre is to horrify you. It's to like make you feel terrible about yourself. And that kind of like self-loathing from reading a book is an experience that a lot of people try to avoid, but it's something that I think a lot of horror fans like myself just have an appreciation for. And this is one of those books where if you want to like really just feel bad and just read things that you're just like, this is never going to leave my memory. This is a classic. This is like a great example of extreme horror. And I don't really like extreme horror that much. I think there's a lot of times where they go too far and they kind of lack the humanity that's going in. And I think one of my favorite aspects about this book, and I think what makes it special in my mind, is it really doesn't lack the humanity. Number 7, I have A Scanner Darkly by Philip K. Dick. So this is the first Philip K. Dick book that I've actually ever read. And I'm not even going to bother trying to explain what this book's about because I don't think I can. But I'll just say that there's a lot of drugs in this book, and there's a lot of kind of like futuristic police detective stuff kind of going on. But this book's just a trip. This book was a big surprise for me. The only reason that I read this book first was I'm a massive fan of Richard Linklater. He's my favorite director. He's the one that directed the adaptation of this book. So I figured I'd start with it first. So I actually haven't seen the movie, but this book's just a trip. And when I say it's a trip, it's not one of those books where you come out the end of it and you're like, wow, that was really crazy. Like it really introduced a lot of concepts, which this book does. But the thing that really got to me was the human impact, the emotional impact that Philip K. Dick put into this book that you could tell comes from a personal state that he was in when he wrote it. And I kind of looked up his life a little because I don't know a lot about Philip K. Dick, and it definitely, he came from a very personal perspective writing this book. And I was shocked at like the epilogue kind of author's note at the end of this book is one of the most impactful things that I've read this year. Number 6, I have House of Chains by Stephen Erickson. This is the 4th book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. This book was a big surprise to me. So kind of going through my thoughts on Malazan so far. Book number 1 I thought was good, but it didn't pull me in quite as much as I hoped to. I've read it about 8 years ago, so obviously it didn't do a lot for me. Dead House Gates was good, but again, I was really kind of lacking that like emotional impact in the series, which a lot of people do get by that point, but just was kind of lacking a little bit for me. Book number 3 I read in 2023, and book number 3 is one of my favorite fantasy books that I've read. I thought it was a massive improvement. It's really what got me engaged with the series as a whole. And so coming back to book number 4, it's connected to book number 2, which while I liked, I wasn't as invested in, but this book really caught me by surprise because I thought all the plot lines in general in this book were just phenomenal. I think the first part of the book, part 1, following the single character, is one of my favorite parts of the series so far. And there's a lot of world building in this book, especially maybe a little bit too much world building. A lot of stuff that's kind of just like, you got to hit the I believe button and just trust that it'll pay off later, which at this point, I fully believe it will pay off later. But just amazing world building in general. The characters, too many to talk about. I'm not going to talk about them here, but just a good book. The ending, while not as climactic as a lot of the other books in the series so far, I loved. One of the chapters towards the end of the book is one of my favorite chapters of all time in the series so far. Number 5, I've narrated The Life of Frederick Douglass by Frederick Douglass. This is a really short memoir written in 1845 by an escaped slave. It's technically a reread for me, but I skimmed it for a school project in like 6th grade, so I'm not going to count it as a reread for the purposes of this video. It's nothing more than just him talking about his life and just talking about the horrors of being a slave. And it's horrifying in a lot of the ways you'd expect, but it's also just the dehumanization aspect that you can't really understand until you listen to somebody that was a slave talk about what their life was and how it made them feel as a human being. It's an important book. I'm not a proponent of the whole like people using everybody should read this book, because as somebody that didn't read a ton of books growing up, we know a lot of people don't read a lot of books. There's very few important books that I would be like, people should read. And this is probably the one that I would recommend just because it's so short. You can get so much from it in just a couple of hours, and it's just an important story and something that we think implicitly that we understand about the human condition that just kind of like reinforces that behavior and actually kind of teaches us why we think the way we think about slavery. Number 4, I have 11/22/63 by Stephen King. I finished this last month. This is just an incredible book. I'm not going to say this is my favorite Stephen King book. I'm not ready to make that commitment quite yet, but it's probably the best book that he's written that I've read so far. It's really just a book that is just solid all the way through. It's really long, but it doesn't feel really long because the pacing is, there's always kind of something engaging happening. There's several plot lines going on at a time that I think all kind of like wrap up at sections in the book that just keep you constantly rolling through. Obviously a passion project for King. He clearly is like extremely engaged with the actual conspiracies themselves, but also just obviously grew up in the 50s and 60s. So this is just a special time that he visits a lot in his books, but he really gets to expand on in 11/22/63. Really just like this book a lot. It's just a great book. Number 3, I have The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. So this is Silence of the Lambs, for those of you who don't know, is kind of a sequel to Red Dragon, which was like the first book that was written that involves Hannibal Lecter, but they're separate books and they can be read separately as one another. I read Red Dragon like 15 years ago. So coming to this book, it had been a while, and I completely forgot a lot of things about how great Thomas Harris is as a writer. Maybe the best writer. I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert on the genre, but out of what I've read so far, he's the best writer in the genre that I've read, 100%. Silence of the Lambs, obviously adapted into one of the greatest movies of all time, one of my favorite movies of all time. So I knew the plot inside and out, and the movie is really a very direct adaptation of the book. Just an incredible story. I think the plot is just amazing. It's part of the reason that the movie works so well and that they didn't really have to make any changes. It just flows and constantly is just engaging throughout the story. I think the thematic aspects of this book was a huge surprise. crime fiction, especially in my opinion, isn't really known for having a lot of thematic work in their books that's implemented super well. But there's a lot of interesting stuff about kind of like feminism and just general, transgenderism that's really well done in this story, in my opinion. And then just the pinnacle of character work that you could have in a story. Starling's one of the greatest crime protagonists of all time. And then to have a character like Hannibal Lecter in your story, one of the most iconic and greatest characters of all time in any work of fiction. And then to top it off, other than Hannibal Lecter, you get Buffalo Bill, who's also one of the greatest villains, I feel like, in crime fiction, at least. It's such a great book. Number 2 is The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie. So after the kind of disappointment that Best Served Cold was for me, I was kind of interested to see how the next standalone would be. And if it was just kind of a case of the standalones weren't for me, or maybe he just wasn't able to hit the same heights as the first Slaw trilogy. So it was a big shock to me when I read this book that it's now my favorite book in the series. This book takes place over the span of a battle over a few days, and it's nothing more than that. And it doesn't need to be anything more than that, really, because it's just interesting. There's all of the POVs in this book I loved. It's hard. There's really not a lot to talk about other than to say it's just got all of the things that I love about Joe Abercrombie as an author, and pretty much none of the weaknesses, none of the weaker POVs that have happened in some of his other books. The plot consistently finds new ways to be engaging, hits on his strengths as a battle writer, which I think Best Served Cold was lacking a little bit, but that you saw in especially like Last Argument of Kings, you're like, oh man, this dude's he writes fights so much better than anybody else that I've read so far. I think it hits on a lot of the capstones of the humor that he has in his books. I think there's some interesting commentary that some of the genius of Joe Abercrombie, I think, is that he's never explicit about what he wants to talk about in his books. He just kind of implements it in a way that just makes sense and is coherent with the stories that are going on. It's kind of that like thematic work that just nothing explicitly has to be said because the characters in the stories, to me at least, feel so fully realized that you just kind of get things out of it that he doesn't really have to explicitly stay at any point. So at number 1, that leaves with Lonesome Dove, which is the greatest book I've ever read. I've tried to talk about this book. I can't just find the words still several months later to like put into a video how much I appreciate this book and do the justice to it that it really deserves. But I'll kind of like reduce it into a simplified way. Plot's great. Doesn't need to be great because everything else is so great that it keeps you engaged. But I think once the plot starts kicking off and you get into like the main heart of what's going on, really eventful, interesting things happening. But plot's like the least important thing looking back on this book for me. Character works, best character work I've ever read in a book, period. Gustus McRae is my favorite character of all time. Every character essentially that, even minor or major, whether they do nothing or they're, the main character of the story, I feel like they're so well realized and they have such relevance to the actual book itself. I think the thematic work is amazing. Really just like a beautiful story that kind of teaches you about humanity portrayed in the Western genre. So you get this expedition going, sparsely populated area, cattle drive going on. And I feel like there's just so many things that I can't say in words that you just kind of have to read the book. And once you've read it and you kind of hear my vague comments that I'm making right now, it'll make sense to you. I think the book's hilarious. I think nobody really talks about the humor because there's so many other great things to talk about. But Larry McMurtry is just one of those guys that just kind of like gets what's funny and what's not funny. And I mean, again, Gus McRae is my favorite character of all time. Pretty much every word, every line he says from beginning to end is just like comedic gold in my mind. The emotional moments in this book hit extremely hard. I think part of like my appreciation for the story is that he doesn't take the easy way out in a lot of ways. It really shows like how hard life was back then and the sacrifices that were made, and just how people dealt with just horrible situations back then in a manner where you can't let it get you down because you just have a job to do. Yeah, I really don't know what else to say. I knew I was going to love the book. I knew it was going to be one of my favorite books of all time. I've seen the film adaptations for Last Picture Show in terms of Endearment, which are both incredible stories and books that I will 100% read after I finish this. I'd like to read the kind of like sequel prequels to Lonesome Dove. I don't really have any expectations for them because I know they can't be the best book of all time because I've already read the best book of all time. But yeah, I don't really have anything else to say. I don't know. It's just like read the book, and then after you've read the book, I can just tell you about like the numerous scenes that I just think about on like at least a weekly basis, which is not really something I do with stories. I love the heroes in Silence of the Lambs, and obviously Silence of the Lambs specifically. I do think about some of the scenes just because I've seen the movie so many times, but there's just so many moments in Lonesome Dove that were impactful for me, and it also the ending just sticks it completely. Yeah, greatest book of all time. What else is there really to say? So yeah, it's all 22 books ranked. Pretty disappointing year in terms of reading quantity for me. I'm pretty satisfied with the actual quality of the books that I've read so far, but hoping that next year I can probably get at least up to like 40 books, depending on how busy life is at the time. And then hopefully when I do the ranking next year, it can be like a 3-hour video if I reach all my goals that I'm probably not going to do. So I appreciate you guys for watching. I hope you have a great day. I'll talk to you later.